Welcome back to another iteration in our video series, Chat Patwah. Lesson 4. Today we're going to look at modals, auxiliary verbs, and a few other things as it pertains to Patwa. If you're a first-time visitor, you may not be able to follow along with us since each of our lessons built on the previous one, but you can check out our YouTube homepage and see our earlier lessons if you want to catch up to where we are. We're going to jump straight into this one, where today we're going to be covering can, can't, want, could, couldn't, should, shouldn't, would, wouldn't. And interestingly enough, how we use have to, must be, and not to in our daily conversations. But before we go into all that, let's re-examine the vowel A in long and short form and how it is responsible for about 95% of the Jamaican accent. We will look at the short A sound when it follows the letter C or G and how it behaves otherwise when it makes the A sound. Okay, so you will find that whenever the short A comes after C or G, there's usually a dominant Y sound in between them. So for example, the word cat in Patwa would sound like cat, with a heavy emphasis on that Y sound. The word car would sound like kyar, and camera would sound like camera. The same rules apply when it comes to the letter G. So for example, a gas can in North America would be a gas can in Patwa. Garbage can becomes garbage can. Now in Patwa, a girl is referred to as a gal, but the rule also applies here, making the pronunciation gyal. We will delve into that in a later lesson because if used incorrectly, it is actually considered an insult. Okay, so moving on to the long form of the vowel A in Patwa. It takes on an EA sound. So for example, the word cake in Patwa would sound like cake. The words are only spelled that way to assist with the pronunciation. Plate would sound like plate. And rake sounds like rake in Patwa. Okay, so moving on to an important exception to this rule. The words make, take, and say are exempt and takes on the forms mek, tek, and se, and are heavily used in Patwa. Let me stress this again. This is very important to note. Here's an example of them being used in conversation. Me a go home, go make a cake. But first, me a go take a taxi. You hear what me I say? This is a good time to pause and review. So to recap, whenever a short A comes after C or G, a dominant Y gets inserted between the two, and it is the more dominant sound that you will hear. For example, cart will sound like kiat. The long vowel A always makes the EA sound. So for example, the word date would sound like date. Date. The exception to the rule is make, take, and say, and they become mek, tek, and se, and they are heavily used in daily conversation. Alright, so if you're still with us, we're moving on. Or as we like to say in Patwa, we are move on. Now let's take a look at the words can, can't, and want, and how they are used in Patwa. So the word can follows the same principle. When the short A gets behind a C or a G, it gets that dominant Y, which is more pronounced. So can ends up sounding like can. Here's an example in conversation. You can give me a call later? I'm going to call you as soon as I can. Okay, so these next two words in Patwa we're going to look at are can't and want. They are similar in the fact that the T at the end of them is dropped and the A in the middle is extended by adding an extra one and dragging out the sound. The only difference is can't follows the CA rule and gets that dominant Y, so it ends up sounding like can't. For the word want, the T at the end is dropped and the A in the middle extended, and it sounds like wah. Here's what all three sounds like in conversation. Welcome to Juicy Patties. We can take your order. We can get a couple patty. How much exactly you want? Sorry, we can't hear you. Okay, so if you're still with me from the beginning till now, you have your Patwa passport and you're not a beginner anymore. You're now at the intermediate level. So congratulations, go ahead and pat yourselves on the back. We still have more to go, so moving right along. Let's look at how we use could, should, would, couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, could have, should have, would have. This one is actually pretty simple. So for the words could, should, and would, you simply add an A to the end, making each coulda, shoulda, and woulda. It's the opposite for the words couldn't, shouldn't, and wouldn't. They all lose the T at the end, making them couldn't, shouldn't, and wouldn't. That's it. It's very important to note that there is no past tense in Patwa, as how it is in the English language. So to remedy this, we use the word did in front of a present tense verb to make it past tense. We'll get into this in detail in a future lesson, but for right now. So for example, in English, the past tense of go, which is went, would be did go in Patwa. Told would be did tell, and sold would be did sell. So in keeping with the current theme, to say could have, should have, and would have, before the verb, you would say coulda did, shoulda did, and woulda did. Here are a few examples in conversation to show you how it would be used. Me coulda did tell you, but you never did a listen, which is I could have told you, but you weren't listening. Me shoulda did tell you, but you never want to hear, which is I should have told you, but you didn't want to hear me. Me woulda did tell you, but you never would have believed me, which is I would have told you, but you would have never believed me. I'll give you some time to process this. Pause if you need to. Okay, so reviewing what we learned in this section. The word can gets the dominant sounding Y between the C and the A, making it can. The word can't also gets the dominant Y between the C and the A, loses the T at the end and gains an extra A, making it can. The word want loses the T at the end, extends the middle A, making it want. Could, should, and would gets an extra A, making them coulda, shoulda, and woulda. And couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't loses the ending T to become couldn't, shouldn't, and wouldn't. And because Patwa has no past tense, could have, should have, and would have is expressed as coulda did, shoulda did, and woulda did. Alright, so we agree that this is a lot of information, or as we like to say in Patwa, a whole heap of info. But in a Patwa conversation, once you get the concept, it will sound like English. Here's a good milestone to pause before we move to the final segment. Alright, so for the final segment, we're going to go over 3 of the most heavily used phrases in daily Patwa conversations. They are have to, must be, and not to. But before we do that, quick review. From one of the previous lessons, we covered the word fi and how it is used in place of the word for. It also replaces the word to, which is what we will be replacing in this application. So going back to the first phrase, have to ends up being haffy. Get used to this word as you will hear it several times in a conversation. To negate this, you simply put the word for don't, which is no, in front of it. So for example, have to would be haffy. Don't have to would be no haffy. When you couple the phrase with go, it suggests something you'll need to do immediately or in the near future. So, for example, here are some more examples using haffy. We are going to have to climb the falls. We have to get the rubber shoes. You don't have to go with the group. You can do it solo. You have to give me a red stripe. Pause here if you need to review. If not, we're moving on. Next up are two words usually paired with each other and commonly used. When you put the words must and be together in Patwa, you end up with the word mussy. It's heavily used to assume the actions of people or events. So for example, in conversation, it would sound like this. You must be mad, which means you must be mad. They must have gone home. They must have gone home. You must think me a fool. You must have thought I'm a fool. No must be him do it. It must be him that did it. That's that for mussy. And finally, for the phrase not to, the use of fi shows up again to represent to. So not and to together ends up being nuffy. Nuffy is sometimes a substitute for the word shouldn't, but in its pure form means not to. Here are a few examples. You know if you go down there, you shouldn't go down there. You know if you do that, you are not to do that. Why you do that when me tell you not to do it? Why did you do that when I told you not to? And me tell him not to put too much pepper upon it. I told him not to put too much pepper on it. This is actually a good spot to pause and review before we move on to the recap. Okay, so going over everything we learned from the beginning of the lesson. We learned every word starting with C-A or G-A, where A is the short sounding vowel A. It gets a dominant Y in the middle. So for example, the word can becomes can, cap is cap, carry becomes carry, gap is gap, gang is gang, gavel is gavel. The long vowel A makes an EA sound, so the word mate becomes mate, date, date, late, late, bake, bake, cake, cake, and lake, lake. The exception to the rule is make, which becomes mek, take, which becomes tek, and say becomes se. The words could, should, and would gains an A to become coulda, shoulda, woulda, and the words couldn't, shouldn't, and wouldn't loses its T to become couldn't, shouldn't, and wouldn't. We covered can, which becomes can, can't, which became can, and want, which becomes wa. We also covered three important daily phrases. Have to, which becomes haffy, must be, which is mussy, and not to, which is nuffy. Okay guys, so we have come to the end of lesson 4. Thanks for hanging out with us, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification button so you'll be the first to know when the next lesson comes out. Feel free to leave us some comments to tell us how we did, and you can like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram. But until the next one, take it easy.